A wealthy CEO, used to getting his way, sneered at the royal guard, then took it a step too far. He spat in the guard's face, believing his money made him untouchable, but what happened next left him humiliated in front of the entire crowd. Here's how it all unfolded. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another story of courage and discipline from the royal guards that you won't want to miss. The afternoon crowd parted reluctantly as Richard Westfield strode through the ornate gates of Buckingham Palace, his Italian designer sunglasses reflecting the summer sun and his growing impatience. Tourists from around the world, cameras at the ready and guidebooks in hand, formed orderly queues for their chance to photograph a slice of British history. But Richard wasn't one for queues. At 42, with 20 years of corporate climbing behind him and the resources of a global corporation at his fingertips, Richard moved with the entitled confidence of a man accustomed to the world bending to his will, rather than the other way around. His bespoke suit, worth more than most people's monthly salary, seemed impervious to the heat that left other visitors fanning themselves and seeking shade. "Rich, slow down," Emma called, hurrying to keep pace with him. Her eyes sparkled with genuine excitement as she took in the palace grounds. "Isn't this amazing? Just think of all the history here." Richard's response was a dismissive grunt as he checked his watch, a timepiece worth more than what most of the tourists around them earned in a month. "It's a building, Emma. An old, inefficient building that should have been converted into luxury condos decades ago," he gestured impatiently at the crowd. "And look at these people, acting like they're seeing something special. It's just elaborate theatre designed to separate tourists from their money." Emma's face fell slightly, but her enthusiasm couldn't be completely dampened. "The royal guards have been protecting the monarchy for centuries. It's not just theatre. They're actual soldiers with combat training and—" "Spare me the Wikipedia article," Richard cut her off, pushing past a family who had stopped to take photos. The father's protest died on his lips as Richard fixed him with a cold stare that had made countless business rivals back down over negotiating tables. "Some of us have places to be." As they approached the area where one of the royal guards stood at perfect attention, Richard's expression transformed into something between amusement and contempt. The guard's scarlet tunic and bearskin cap gleamed in the afternoon light, his ceremonial rifle held with precision born of countless hours of training and discipline. "Now this," Richard said, his voice carrying loudly enough to make several nearby visitors turn, "is the ultimate example of outdated British inefficiency. A grown man playing dress-up while the taxpayers foot the bill." "Look at him," Richard continued, circling the guard like a predator sizing up prey, standing there in that ridiculous hat. "What is that thing anyway? A dead bear? How very progressive." His laugh carried across the courtyard, drawing uncomfortable glances from other tourists who instinctively created space around the unfolding scene. Emma stepped closer, lowering her voice to an urgent whisper. "Rich, please. These guards are active duty military personnel. That uniform represents centuries of tradition and service. I read that they rotate between ceremonial duties and actual combat deployments. Many of them have served in active duty, please." Richard cut her off with a dismissive wave that silenced her instantly, a gesture perfected in countless board meetings where dissenting opinions were unwelcome. What's he guarding against exactly? Selfie sticks? The terrible threat of tourists with questions? Maybe he's defending the monarchy from the dangerous advance of the modern world. He pulled out his phone, the latest model not yet available to the general public, checking his emails with theatrical boredom, while several notifications from his executive team flashed across the screen. "In America, our military does actual work, Emma, patrolling borders, conducting operations, protecting real interests. Not standing around like department store mannequins while tourists gawk. That's the difference between a global superpower and a fading empire clinging to outdated traditions." A group of school children on a field trip slowed their pace as they passed, their teacher guiding them away from Richard's increasingly loud commentary. An elderly British couple lingered nearby, the man's posture straightening almost imperceptibly as Richard continued his tirade. The polished regimental pin on his lapel caught the sunlight as he exchanged a meaningful glance with his wife. "Did you know," Emma tried again, reaching for Richard's arm, "that many royal guards have served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other combat zones? This ceremonial duty is actually considered—" "Emma, enough with the tour guide routine," Richard snapped, shrugging off her touch. "I run a Fortune 500 company. I recognize theatre when I see it." He gestured at the guard's ceremonial rifle. "That thing's probably not even loaded. It's all smoke and mirrors, designed to impress gullible tourists." Richard took another step closer to the guard, invading the invisible boundary of respect most tourists instinctively maintained. The summer heat had intensified, but the guard showed no sign of discomfort in his heavy ceremonial uniform. His eyes remained fixed forward, discipline evident in every line of his posture. "I wonder what it takes to get one of these toys to move," Richard mused loudly, circling the guard with the same calculating gaze he used when evaluating struggling companies for hostile takeovers. His footsteps were deliberate, measuring the space around the guard as if assessing property values in prime real estate. "Is there a SPAT code word? Do they respond to abracadabra? Or, wait, maybe it's God Save the Queen?" He chuckled at his own joke, glancing around to ensure others appreciated his wit. "Or perhaps they only respond to royalty itself. What does that say about a modern democracy, that your soldiers only answer to a hereditary monarch?" The mockery in his tone was unmistakable, as he waved a hand inches from the guard's face, close enough to feel the warmth but not quite making contact. Understanding instinctively where the legal line was drawn, while deliberately pushing its boundaries. "Richard!" Emma hissed, mortification evident in her flushed face. "Stop it right now! This isn't funny." She turned to a nearby British mother who was hurrying her children away. "I'm so sorry, he's not usually like this." But Richard was beyond hearing her. Something about the guard's perfect composure seemed to personally offend him, like a direct challenge to his authority. "See? This is exactly what's wrong with tradition for tradition's sake. Back home, I employ ex-military security who actually serve a purpose. They move when needed, take action when required. This?" He gestured at the guard. "This is just pageantry masquerading as function." The elderly man who had been watching stepped forward, his bearing suggesting military background, despite his advanced years. "Young man," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, "I suggest you reconsider your approach. The Queen's Guard deserves—" "The Queen's Guard deserves what? A participation trophy?" Richard interrupted, turning his back on the older man as if he were beneath further acknowledgement. Emma made one last attempt, physically placing herself between Richard and the guard. "That's enough. You're being completely disrespectful. These guards are a symbol of outdated thinking," Richard finished for her. "Symbols don't deserve respect just because they're old, Emma. That's the kind of backward thinking that holds companies back, that holds countries back." Emma stepped back, genuine hurt flashing in her eyes. "I don't even recognize you right now," she said quietly. "If this is who you really are, I think I need to reconsider some things." The afternoon sun beat down on the palace courtyard as Richard's words hung in the air, sharp and contemptuous. His dismissal of Emma only seemed to fuel his determination to provoke a reaction from the guard. "Let me educate you on something," Richard announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority he used in corporate presentations when explaining complex financial strategies to investors who couldn't possibly grasp the brilliance of his vision. He stood straighter, shoulders back, chin slightly elevated, the power pose he'd perfected after working with a body language coach who charged $5,000 per session. "In America, our soldiers are actively defending freedom around the world. Real missions, real purpose, real impact. Our military budget exceeds the GDP of most countries for a reason." He gestured at the guard's ceremonial rifle with a manicured finger, the platinum signet ring on his right hand catching the sunlight. They're not standing like statues for tourist photos or playing dress-up for the sake of tradition. They're securing interests, protecting assets, maintaining America's position as the leader of the free world. This, he made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the palace, the guard, and by extension Britain itself, is just living in the past while pretending it's still relevant. A few American tourists in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, one man in a USA baseball cap shaking his head in evident disagreement. Richard didn't notice, too consumed with his performance. "I employ ex-Navy SEALs on my security team," he continued, pacing around the guard like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "Men who've seen real combat, who understand real discipline, not this theatrical display of outdated pomp." He paused directly in front of the guard, deliberately blocking the view of tourists trying to take photos. "Any one of them is twice the soldier you'll ever be, playing dress-up here while real warriors do the actual fighting." Emma had stepped back, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, a mixture of embarrassment and anger evident in her rigid posture. "I'm leaving, Richard," she announced, her voice tight with emotion. "This isn't what I signed up for. Enjoy your power trip, alone." Richard barely glanced at her, too invested in his confrontation to register the potential personal cost. "Go ahead," he replied dismissively. "The hotel's easy enough to find. I'll be there when I'm finished here." "You want to know something truly pathetic?" Richard continued, his frustration growing at the guard's continued composure. "In the time you've been standing here today, my company has generated more revenue than your entire regiment probably sees in a year. That's the difference between serving a purpose and serving a tradition." Emma took a decisive step forward, her patience finally exhausted. "That's enough, Richard. I'm not just leaving the palace, I'm leaving London. Enjoy your business meetings without me." The finality in her voice suggested she meant far more than just the trip. Richard's face contorted with growing frustration as the guard maintained his perfect composure, unmoved by insults that would have provoked most men to action. It was this discipline, this refusal to acknowledge him, that seemed to infuriate Richard most deeply. In boardrooms across America, his voice commanded immediate attention. His entrance into rooms caused conversations to halt. Yet here, before this red-coated soldier, his importance evaporated like morning mist. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Richard's voice had lost its performative quality, dropping to something rawer and more personal. "Standing there, ignoring me, as if your silence somehow makes you superior." His expensive leather shoes scraped against the historic cobblestones as he stepped even closer, close enough that the guard could likely feel his breath. "Let me tell you something about superior. I employ people like you, people who think their service makes them special, until they realize that in the real world, power comes from what you own, not what uniform you wore." Emma had stopped her retreat, watching with growing alarm as Richard's demeanour changed from mocking to something darker. The crowd sensed it too. Parents pulled children closer. Phones were lowered as the entertainment factor of the confrontation gave way to genuine concern. "Richard," Emma called, one final attempt to reach him. "Don't do something you'll regret." But Richard was beyond hearing. His face had flushed deep red, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple, as his anger crystallized into something ugly and personal. "Look at me when I'm talking to you!" Richard's voice rose to a shout, echoing off the palace walls. A few tourists gasped at the sudden increase in volume, the shift from uncomfortable viewing to genuine alarm palpable in the afternoon air. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for those witnessing it. Richard's face contorted with a rage born of lifelong entitlement, finally meeting immovable resistance. With deliberate, calculated malice, he gathered the saliva in his mouth. The crowd's collective intake of breath created a moment of vacuum-like silence as Richard leaned forward and spat directly into the guard's face. The spittle landed on the guard's cheek, just below his right eye, glistening there in the sunlight like a badge of ultimate disrespect. For a heartbeat, absolute silence enveloped the courtyard. Even the distant traffic seemed to fade away as the enormity of the transgression registered with every witness. The guard didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. The saliva ran slowly down his cheek, but his expression remained as composed as the palace stones themselves. This supreme discipline, in the face of what might be the most personal of insults, was somehow more intimidating than any reaction could have been. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, genuine shock replacing her previous embarrassment. Several tourists turned away, unable to process the level of disrespect they had just witnessed. A mother covered her young son's eyes, while another visitor frantically waved toward palace security. Richard stood his ground, a triumphant smirk playing across his lips as if he'd somehow won a victory. "See?" he announced to the stunned crowd. "Not even that gets a reaction, because he can't react. Because this is all just an elaborate show for tourists, and he's nothing but The sharp sound of boots on stone cut through his words, precise, measured, purposeful. From around the corner of the palace wall, a uniformed figure approached with the unmistakable bearing of authority. The guard captain's uniform gleamed in the afternoon sun, his pace neither hurried nor delayed, but carrying the inevitable weight of consequence. Richard's smirk faltered slightly as he registered the new arrival, then reasserted itself with the confidence of a man who believed wealth could solve any problem. "Oh, look," he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "The head costume wearer has arrived." The guard captain's approach brought a sudden, expectant hush over the courtyard. His uniform, adorned with insignia that spoke of decades of service rather than mere ceremony, caught the afternoon sun as he came to a precise halt 2 paces from the guard. "Guard Jenkins," the captain addressed the motionless soldier, his voice carrying the quiet authority of actual command experience. "Report." Only then, with proper authorization established through chain of command, did the guard move. His movement was not the startled reaction Richard had tried to provoke, but rather the precise, disciplined motion of military protocol. He came to attention, a subtle shift in posture that somehow made him appear even more formidable. "Sir," the guard acknowledged, his voice level and professional, showing no trace of the provocation he had endured. "Civilian has engaged in deliberate harassment, culminating in physical assault through expectoration on a member of the Queen's Guard while on duty, sir." The clinical description, delivered with perfect military precision, seemed to strip Richard's actions of their power, reducing his provocations to their bare, undignified essence. Several onlookers nodded in grim satisfaction at the accurate assessment. "Understood, Guard Jenkins," the captain replied, his eyes finally turning to Richard with an assessing gaze that seemed to catalogue and dismiss him in the same moment. "You have permission to address the situation." Richard's smirk faltered, uncertainty replacing his previous confidence as he registered the formal exchange. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face, the dawning recognition that he might have miscalculated. "Listen," he began, his tone automatically shifting to the one he used when backtracking in business negotiations. "This has all been a bit of cultural misunderstanding. I was simply—" "Sir," the guard interrupted, the single word carrying more authority than Richard's entire tirade. With deliberate ceremonial precision, the guard reached up with a white-gloved hand and slowly wiped the spittle from his cheek. The motion was unhurried, dignified, and somehow more devastating than any angry reaction could have been. Guard Jenkins shifted his stance with military precision, facing Richard directly for the first time. The movement was not dramatic, but it carried the weight of focused attention that made several onlookers step back instinctively. His eyes, which had been fixed forward throughout Richard's tirade, now locked onto the CEO with unsettling intensity. "Sir," Jenkins began, his voice level and controlled, carrying the quiet authority that comes not from volume, but from absolute certainty. Each word was delivered with the precision of a soldier who understood that sometimes words themselves must be deployed with tactical efficiency. The disciplined tone commanded attention more effectively than Richard's shouting ever could, drawing the crowd into a respectful silence. "I am Lance Corporal Michael Jenkins, 2nd Battalion, Grenadier Guards. I have served 3 tours in Afghanistan: Helmand Province, Kandahar and Kabul. I've completed 1 tour in Iraq during the height of the insurgency, participated in NATO operations in Eastern Europe, and served in joint task forces with your American forces in counter-terrorism operations that don't appear in press briefings or corporate annual reports." The guard removed his bearskin cap with a single fluid motion, revealing close-cropped hair and a faded scar running along his temple. The ceremonial aspect of his presence seemed to fall away, revealing the combat soldier beneath the pageantry. "This uniform you've been mocking represents over 350 years of continuous service to the Crown," Jenkins continued, each word precise and measured. "Every button, every seam, every medal and insignia has been earned through blood and sacrifice on battlefields across the world." Richard's complexion had paled significantly, his earlier bravado evaporating under the guard's steady gaze. The crowd had grown completely silent, witnessing what felt increasingly like a historic moment rather than a tourist disruption. "While you were building your corporate empire, sir, I was pulling wounded civilians from collapsed buildings in Helmand Province. The rifle you dismissed as ceremonial? I've used its operational counterpart to defend convoy positions when under direct enemy fire." Jenkins gestured to a medal on his chest that Richard had previously mocked. "This commendation was awarded after our unit held position for 18 hours during a Taliban offensive, despite losing 3 men and running critically low on ammunition." "The stillness you ridiculed as weakness," Jenkins continued, his voice gaining a subtle intensity without rising in volume. "That discipline is what keeps soldiers alive when instinct screams to run. It's what allows us to make clear decisions when everything around us is chaos. It's what separates trained military personnel from civilians playing at war." Jenkins replaced his bearskin cap with the same ceremonial precision with which he'd removed it, the action drawing a visible line between his personal address and his return to official duty. "You spoke of your security team, sir. I've trained alongside American forces, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon. They're outstanding soldiers who would be the first to tell you that what you've done here today disrespects not just British military tradition, but the brotherhood of all who serve." The Metropolitan Police officers approached with professional calm, their uniforms less ornate than the Royal Guards, but carrying their own weight of authority. The female officer took position slightly ahead of her male colleague, addressing Richard with crisp efficiency. "Sir, I'm Officer Bennett with the Metropolitan Police. You're being detained on suspicion of assault against a member of the armed forces on duty, a violation of Section 39 of the Criminal Justice Act, as well as potential violations under the Public Order Act." Her tone was matter-of-fact, neither aggressive nor apologetic. "I need to see your identification, please." Richard produced his passport with trembling fingers, the embossed golden eagle suddenly seeming less like a symbol of protection and more like a mark of identification. "I want to call the American Embassy," he stated, attempting to reclaim some control of the situation, "and my attorney. This is being blown completely out of proportion." "You'll have the opportunity to make those calls from the station, Mr. Westfield. At this time, I need to inform you that assaulting a member of Her Majesty's forces while on duty is taken extremely seriously under British law." "Do you have any idea who I am?" Richard interrupted, desperation edging into his voice. My company employs over 3,000 people in the UK alone. I've had private meetings with your Prime Minister. This will become an international incident if you proceed." The male officer, who had remained silent until now, spoke with the resigned patience of someone who had heard similar claims before. "Sir, I can assure you that the law applies equally to everyone on British soil, regardless of their corporate position or political connections." He gestured toward the palace. "In the shadow of that building, perhaps more than anywhere else in Britain, no one stands above the law." Emma approached cautiously, addressing Officer Bennett rather than Richard. "I was with him, but I'm not involved in what he did." Her voice wavered slightly, the emotional toll of the afternoon evident in her expression. "Should I come to the station as well?" "That won't be necessary at this stage, miss," Bennett replied. "We have sufficient witnesses, including recorded footage. If we need your statement later, we'll contact you." She glanced at Richard. "Though separating yourself from the situation is probably wise." Richard's face contorted with betrayal as he watched Emma physically and symbolically distance herself. "Emma, you can't seriously be—" "I've seen enough, Richard," she cut him off, her voice quiet but firm. "The man you've been today, that's not someone I want in my life." She turned to Guard Jenkins, who had resumed his ceremonial position, but was obviously aware of the unfolding scene. "I'm deeply sorry for what happened. Your service deserves better respect than what was shown today." As the officers prepared to escort Richard away, the captain addressed him one final time. "Mr. Westfield, before you depart, there's something you should understand about the guards you've been mocking. Every man who stands post here has earned the right through actual combat service. What you dismissed as pageantry is, in fact, a rotation of duty for active military personnel who have proven themselves where it matters most." "I'd like to resolve this without formal charges," Richard attempted, as the officers guided him toward the exit. His voice had taken on the placating tone he reserved for difficult business negotiations. "Surely we can come to some arrangement that doesn't involve stations and paperwork. A donation to a military charity, perhaps?" Officer Bennett's expression remained professionally neutral. "That's not how our legal system operates, Mr. Westfield. Attempting to buy your way out of legal consequences could actually constitute a separate offence." She gestured toward the waiting police car. "We'll process you according to standard procedure." As Richard was escorted away, the elderly couple who had witnessed the entire incident approached Emma. The gentleman wore his military background in his bearing even without a uniform. "Difficult situation you found yourself in, my dear," the woman said kindly, her British reserve softened by genuine sympathy. "Not an easy thing seeing someone's true character revealed so publicly." Emma nodded, blinking back tears that seemed to be as much from relief as distress. "I thought I knew him. 3 years together, and I never saw—" She gestured helplessly at the space Richard had occupied. "People often show their truest selves when confronted with something they can't control or purchase," the gentleman observed, his voice carrying the wisdom of experience. "In my 30 years of military service, I found that respect for tradition was often a reliable measure of a person's character." The afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the palace grounds as tourists resumed their previous activities. Guard Jenkins stood at his post, his discipline unbroken, his dignity intact, despite the assault he had endured. In his perfect posture was a silent reminder of the values Richard had failed to recognize: honour, sacrifice, and the strength that comes not from wealth or position, but from service to something greater than oneself. Emma took one last look at the guard, offering a respectful nod that acknowledged both his service and his composure during the confrontation. Then she turned away, walking alone through the palace gates with the measured steps of someone who had glimpsed a fork in her life's path and chosen the direction leading toward greater wisdom. What price can you put on dignity? What value can you assign to honour? In today's world of instant gratification and material success, it's easy to forget that some things remain beyond purchase: respect, integrity, and the quiet strength that comes from serving something greater than ourselves. The Royal Guards who stand watch at Britain's historic sites aren't merely tourist attractions or ceremonial figureheads. They are active duty soldiers, combat veterans who have earned their positions through service and sacrifice few civilians will ever fully comprehend. Their stillness isn't weakness. It's the ultimate demonstration of discipline, the controlled power that forms the backbone of military excellence worldwide. What would you have done in Guard Jenkins's position? Could you have maintained such perfect composure in the face of deliberate disrespect? And how might we all benefit from cultivating that kind of disciplined response to life's provocations? If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might appreciate this reminder about true strength and dignity. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about Royal Guards and the values they represent. And don't forget to hit that bell icon so you never miss our newest uploads. The videos appearing on your screen now offer more insights into the traditions and truths behind these iconic guardians. Until next time, remember that real respect isn't demanded. It's earned through character, discipline, and service.